I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the jogger cutting through my backyard at 6 in the morning. I'd been living at 4782 Oakmont Drive in Westerville, Ohio, for exactly 3 weeks, and this was the fifth time I'd spotted someone treating my property like it was public land. The woman in neon pink athletic wear didn't even glance at the house as she jogged past my kitchen window, her ponytail bouncing rhythmically as she followed what appeared to be a well-worn path through the overgrown grass near the tree line. My name is Quinton Thatcher, and I'd inherited this property from my grandfather after he passed away last spring. The house was a modest ranch-style home built in 1948, sitting on 2.5 acres that backed up to a small wooded area. I'd grown up visiting this place every summer, but I'd never noticed the steady stream of people using the property as a shortcut. Then again, my grandfather had let the backyard grow wild in his final years, and the so-called trail had become pretty established. I stepped outside with my coffee, still in my pajama pants and an old college sweatshirt. The morning air was crisp for late April, and I could see my breath as I walked toward the tree line. The path was obvious once I looked for it, a dirt track about 3 feet wide that wound through my property and connected to the subdivision on the other side of the woods. Someone had even placed decorative stones along portions of the trail. That afternoon, I was unpacking boxes in the garage when a silver Lexus pulled into my driveway. A woman in her mid-40s stepped out, wearing white capris and a lavender cardigan that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her blonde hair was styled in that specific way that screamed, "I'd like to speak to the manager," and she carried a leather-bound notebook like it was a religious text. "Hello there," she called out, her voice dripping with the kind of artificial sweetness that immediately put me on guard. "You must be the new owner. I'm Brenda Carmichael, president of the Oakmont Estates Homeowners Association." I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked over. "Quinton Thatcher, nice to meet you." "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I wanted to stop by and introduce myself, and also discuss a small matter regarding the walking trail."
Walking trail?
Brenda gestured toward my backyard. "Yes, the community trail that runs through your property. It's been there for years. Such a lovely amenity for the neighborhood. The residents really appreciate having access to nature." I felt my jaw tighten. "That trail is on my private property." "Well, yes, technically," Brenda said, waving her hand dismissively, "but it's been in use for so long that it's essentially become a community resource. I'm sure you understand how important it is to maintain good relationships with your neighbors. Besides, your grandfather never had any issues with it." "My grandfather was 93 and could barely see past his front porch in his last years," I said. "But that doesn't change the fact that this is my property. I have the deed right inside." Brenda's smile became even more strained. "Mr. Thatcher, I think you'll find that the HOA has certain rights regarding community amenities. Perhaps you're not familiar with how these things work. Why don't you come to our next meeting on Thursday? We can discuss this in a more official capacity." "There's nothing to discuss," I said. "People are trespassing on my land." She clicked her tongue. "I really think you should reconsider your position. The HOA takes a dim view of residents who don't act in the community's best interest." With that, she climbed back into her Lexus and drove off, leaving me standing in my driveway wondering what I'd just gotten myself into. That evening, I dug out the property deed from the filing cabinet my grandfather had left in the basement. The document was yellowed with age but perfectly legible. The property boundaries were clearly marked, and there was no mention of any easement or right-of-way for a walking trail. The land had been in my family since 1948, when my grandfather bought it fresh out of the Army. Back then, it had been farmland, well before the subdivision was built in the 1980s. I spent the next few days doing research. I contacted a property lawyer named Mitchell Hayes who had an office in downtown Columbus. He reviewed my deed and the HOA's covenant documents, which I'd found in another box in the basement. "You're absolutely right," Mitchell told me during our phone consultation. "The trail is entirely on your property, and there's no legal easement. The HOA has no authority over your land. In fact, looking at the plat maps, your property predates the HOA by about 35 years. You're not even technically part of the Homeowners Association." "What do you mean?" The HOA was formed when the Oakmont Estates subdivision was developed in 1983, he explained. Your property is the original Thatcher parcel. It was never subdivided or included in the HOA's jurisdiction. Legally, you have no obligation to follow their rules at all. This was better news than I'd expected. So I can shut down the trail? Absolutely. You own the land and people are trespassing. You have every right to restrict access. I'd recommend putting up clear signage first, and if that doesn't work, you can install fencing. Just make sure the fence is entirely on your property. I can send you a surveyor's contact information to mark the exact boundaries. I thanked Mitchell and hung up feeling vindicated. The next morning, I printed out a dozen signs that read, "Private property, no trespassing," and posted them along the trail at 20-foot intervals. I made sure they were polite but firm, and I included a note explaining that the trail crossed private land and was not a public right-of-way. The reaction was immediate. By that afternoon, my phone started ringing. The number was unlisted, but I answered anyway. It was Brenda Carmichael, and she was no longer using her fake sweet voice. "Mr. Thatcher, what exactly do you think you're doing?" "Posting signs on my property," I said calmly. "Those signs are creating a hostile environment for our community members. I've had 3 calls from concerned residents who feel threatened by a sign explaining property law. This is completely unacceptable," Brenda snapped. "You're going to remove those signs immediately, or the HOA will take action." "HOA has no authority over my property," I said. "I've had a lawyer review the documents. My land predates your organization by decades, and I'm not a member. You can't enforce any rules on me." There was a long pause. When Brenda spoke again, her voice was ice cold. "We'll see about that. You've just made a very big mistake, Mr. Thatcher." She hung up before I could respond. I should have been worried, but instead I felt energized. I'd dealt with bullies before, and I wasn't about to let some power-hungry HOA president push me around. The next day was Thursday, and out of curiosity, I decided to attend the HOA meeting. It was held at the community center, a bland beige building at the entrance to the subdivision. About 30 people were scattered around a room that could have held 100. Brenda sat at a table at the front with 2 other board members. A thin man in his 60s named Gerald and a younger woman named Stephanie who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Brenda's eyes narrowed when she saw me walk in, but she didn't acknowledge me. The meeting started with the usual boring business, discussions about landscaping contracts and pool maintenance schedules. Then, during the open forum section, Brenda cleared her throat. "I want to address a serious situation that has recently developed," she announced. "A new resident has taken it upon himself to block access to our community walking trail. This trail has been in use for over 20 years and represents an important amenity for our neighborhood. The board has researched the matter, and we believe we have a strong case for an easement by prescription." Several residents turned to look at me. I raised my hand. "Yes," Brenda said, her tone dripping with condescension. I stood up. "For those who don't know, I'm Quinton Thatcher. I recently inherited the property at 4782 Oakmont Drive. I've consulted with a property attorney, and I can tell you definitively that there is no legal easement on my land. The property has been in my family since 1948, and it was never part of this HOA's jurisdiction." "That's your opinion," Brenda said. "It's not an opinion. It's legal fact. I have the deed, the plat maps, and a lawyer who specializes in property law. Your trail is trespassing on private land." A woman in the 3rd row raised her hand. "But we've been using that trail for years. My kids grew up playing in those woods." "I understand that," I said, trying to keep my voice reasonable. "But that doesn't create a legal right. My grandfather was elderly and probably didn't realize what was happening. That doesn't transfer ownership or create an easement." Gerald, the thin man on the board, spoke up. "In Ohio, there's a concept called adverse possession. If the trail has been in continuous use for 21 years, it could be considered public access. I'd researched this too. Adverse possession requires that the use be hostile, actual, open, notorious, exclusive, and continuous for 21 years. But more importantly, it requires that the person claiming the easement have been using the land under a claim of right, not with the permission of the owner. Even if my grandfather didn't actively object, his tolerance of the trail doesn't meet the legal standard for adverse possession. And frankly, I doubt you can prove continuous use for the full 21 years anyway. Brenda's face was turning red. This is ridiculous. You can't just move into a neighborhood and disrupt established community practices. I can when those practices involve trespassing on my property, I replied. Look, I'm not trying to be unreasonable, but this is my land, and I have the right to control who uses it. The meeting devolved into arguments after that. Several residents were on my side, pointing out that property rights were important. Others insisted that community harmony should take precedence. Brenda eventually gavelled the meeting to a close, but not before announcing that the HOA would be consulting its own lawyer. Over the next week, I hired a surveyor named Tom Rodriguez to mark my property boundaries with stakes and bright orange tape. The results confirmed what I already knew. The trail cut across my land for about 200 yards, entirely within my property lines. There was no ambiguity. I also started documenting every time someone used the trail. I set up a simple trail camera near the most trafficked section, not to invade anyone's privacy, but to have a record of the trespassing. The footage showed dozens of people per day, joggers, dog walkers, teenagers on bikes, even someone on a horse once. On a Saturday morning, I was measuring the fence line when Brenda appeared again, this time with a man in an expensive suit. "Mr. Thatcher," she called out. "This is Richard Bainbridge, the HOA's attorney." Richard extended his hand, and I shook it. He had the smooth confidence of someone who'd won a lot of courtroom battles. "Mr. Thatcher, I've reviewed the situation, and I believe there's room for negotiation here. The HOA is prepared to offer you a reasonable compromise." "I'm listening," I said. "We propose that you grant a formal easement for the trail," Richard said. "In exchange, the HOA will take responsibility for all maintenance and liability. We'll post signs making it clear that users are guests on private property, and will ensure proper conduct. You'll lose no actual use of your land since the trail only crosses an unused wooded section. And if I refuse, then we'll be forced to pursue legal action," Richard said. "We believe we have grounds for an easement by prescription, and we're prepared to fight this in court. That will be expensive and time-consuming for everyone involved." Brenda jumped in. "You need to understand that you're the newcomer here, Mr. Thatcher. This community has functioned perfectly well without your interference. If you continue to be obstinate, you'll find yourself very unwelcome in Westerville." I looked at them both. "First of all, I'm not part of your HOA, so your opinion of me is irrelevant. Second, this isn't about being a good neighbor. This is about my property rights. And third, I've been documenting all the trespassing. If you want to go to court, we can discuss damages for every single violation." Richard's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of concern in his eyes. "There's no need for hostility. Then there's no need for threats," I replied. "Here's my position. The trail is on my private property, and I want it gone. I'm giving you and your members 30 days to stop using it. After that, I'm putting up a fence." "You can't do that," Brenda sputtered. "The cost alone would be—" "I've already gotten quotes," I interrupted. "A 6-foot privacy fence running along my property line. It'll be expensive, but it's worth it to protect my rights." Richard pulled out a business card. "Mr. Thatcher, I strongly encourage you to reconsider. Litigation benefits no one. Call me if you change your mind." They left, and I got back to work. That 30-day deadline wasn't arbitrary. I'd learned from Mitchell Hayes that posting clear notice and giving reasonable time to comply would strengthen my position if this did end up in court. The backlash started almost immediately. Someone left a nasty note in my mailbox calling me selfish and unneighborly. My trash cans were knocked over twice. A few residents started giving me dirty looks when I was out, but others quietly told me they supported my position, even if they didn't want to say so publicly for fear of HOA retaliation. One of those people was an older gentleman named Frank Morrison who lived 3 houses down. He stopped by one evening with a 6-pack of beer. "I wanted to tell you I think you're doing the right thing," Frank said as we sat on my porch. "Brenda Carmichael has been running this neighborhood like her personal fiefdom for 10 years. Someone needs to stand up to her. She seems pretty used to getting her way," I observed. "That's an understatement," Frank said. "She's fined people for having their trash cans out an hour too long. She tried to force the Hendersons to repaint their house because she didn't, like the shade of gray they chose, even though it was well within the approved color palette. And last year, she had the Nguyen family's vegetable garden declared a violation because it was aesthetically inappropriate. How is she still in charge? Most people are too intimidated to run against her, Frank explained. And she's got a core group of supporters who vote however she tells them to. Plus, frankly, a lot of residents don't pay attention to HOA politics until it affects them directly. What about the trail specifically? When did it start? Frank thought for a moment. I moved here in 1997, and it was already being used then, but not heavily. Your grandfather, he was a nice old guy, but he kept to himself. I don't think he even knew people were using his land. The trail really took off about 15 years ago, when Brenda organized a community wellness initiative. She had those decorative stones placed, put up a little sign at the entrance calling it the Oakmont Nature Trail, made it seem official. Even though she had no right to do any of that. Exactly. And now she's convinced everyone that it's a community amenity that can't be taken away. Frank took a swig of his beer. But here's the thing you should know. Brenda doesn't just want the trail because residents like it. Her property is one of the ones that benefits most from the trail access. Her backyard connects to the path, and she uses it to walk her dog every morning. This is personal for her. That explained a lot. After Frank left, I spent the evening thinking about my options. I could back down, grant the easement, and have an easier life. But the principle mattered to me. This was my property, inherited from my grandfather who'd worked hard to buy it. I wasn't going to let a neighborhood busybody bully me into giving up my rights. The 30 days passed slowly. I continued to document trail usage and ignored the occasional hostile encounter. One morning, a jogger actually yelled at me that I was ruining the neighborhood. Another time, someone let their dog poop on my front lawn, which I was pretty sure was retaliation. But I also used the time productively. I got quotes from 3 different fencing companies and chose a local business called Hoffman Fencing that had good reviews. The owner, Dave Hoffman, came out personally to discuss the project. That's a lot of fence line, Dave said, walking the boundary with me. About 400 linear feet if you want to completely block the trail access. With the privacy fence you're looking at, we're talking around $12,000. It was a big chunk of my savings, but I'd expected as much. How long will it take to install? We can have it done in a week, weather permitting. We'll need to get the property survey certified and pull a permit from the township, but that's pretty routine. Let's do it, I said. Dave grinned. I've heard about your situation through the grapevine. Half the neighborhood thinks you're a hero, and the other half thinks you're a villain. For what it's worth, I think property rights matter. We'll take good care of you. On day 31, I posted a final notice along the trail, effective immediately. This property is closed to public access. Trespassing will be prosecuted. Fence installation begins Monday. I also sent a certified letter to the HOA board informing them of my intentions. Brenda called within an hour, screaming into the phone. You can't do this. We'll get an injunction. Feel free to try, I said calmly. I've given you 30 days notice, and I've done everything by the book. If you want to waste your money on a lawyer, that's your choice. You're destroying community property. It's not community property, it's my property, and I'm done arguing about it. I hung up and blocked her number. Monday morning, Dave Hoffman's crew arrived with a truck full of materials. They started at the northern edge of my property and began setting posts. The fence was a standard 6-foot cedar privacy design, nothing fancy but solid and effective. By Tuesday afternoon, curious onlookers had gathered on the other side of the property line, watching the work progress. Some residents looked annoyed, but others seemed fascinated by the drama. The fence crew worked efficiently, and by Wednesday they'd completed about half the run. That's when things escalated. I came home from the grocery store on Wednesday afternoon to find Brenda standing in my driveway with 2 police officers. My heart sank, but I kept my composure as I got out of the car. That's him, Brenda said, pointing at me. He's illegally blocking a public trail. The officers, a young woman named Officer Patterson and an older man named Officer DeMarco, looked uncomfortable. Officer DeMarco approached me. Sir, we've received a complaint about illegal construction. Can you tell me what's going on? I explains the situation calmly, showing them my property deed, the survey, and the permits from the township. Officer Patterson reviewed the documents carefully. Madam, she said to Brenda, These documents appear to be in order. The fence is on his property, and he has the proper permits. But he's blocking a community trail, Brenda insisted. A trail on his private property, Officer DeMarco said. Madam, unless you have documentation showing a legal easement, this is a civil matter, not a criminal one. We can't do anything here. Brenda's face turned purple. This is outrageous. I'm calling the mayor. The officers exchanged a look. You're free to do that, madam, Officer Patterson said. But right now, we need to clear out so these folks can get back to work. You're on private property without permission. After they left, Dave Hoffman walked over, chuckling. That was entertaining. In 20 years of fencing, I've never had the cops called on a job. Sorry about that, I said. Don't be. Like I said, you're in the right, he paused. Though I should mention, we've had a few people come by trying to interfere with the work. Nothing serious, just folks asking questions and one guy who tried to tell my crew they were breaking the law. We've been ignoring them, but I wanted you to know. Thanks for the heads up. Let me know if it becomes a real problem. The fence was completed on Friday afternoon. It looked great, a solid barrier that clearly marked my property boundaries and completely blocked access to the unauthorized trail. Dave's crew cleaned up the work site, and I walked the entire length, feeling satisfied with the result. That evening, Frank Morrison stopped by again, this time without beer. He looked worried. Quinton, I need to warn you about something. There's an emergency HOA meeting tomorrow night. Brenda's been rallying people, claiming you're violating community standards and threatening property values. She's pushing for the board to sue you. Let them sue, I said. I've done everything legally. I know, but Brenda's convinced she can win on the easement by prescription argument. She's been gathering testimonials from residents about how long they've used the trail. Some people are saying it's been there for 30 years. Saying it and proving it are two different things, I pointed out. And even if it's been used that long, which I doubt, they still can't meet the legal requirements for adverse possession. I'm just saying, be careful. Brenda gets nasty when she doesn't get her way. There are rumors she's planning something beyond just legal action. Frank's warning stuck with me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. I'd won the battle, but the war might just be starting. Saturday morning brought vindication. I woke up to find someone had spray-painted "selfish jerk" on my new fence. I took photos immediately and called the police. This time, a different officer responded, a Detective Sarah Moreno, who seemed genuinely interested in the case. This is clearly vandalism, she said, examining the graffiti. Have you had ongoing issues with your neighbors? I explained the whole situation, including the HOA conflict. Detective Moreno took detailed notes. Do you have any security cameras? She asked. Just the trail cam in the back, but it's not pointed at the fence. I'd recommend installing cameras covering your property, especially near the street. This kind of dispute can bring out the worst in people. She handed me a case number. File a report with your insurance if you need to clean this up, and call us immediately if anything else happens. I spent the rest of the day installing security cameras. I bought a set of 4 wireless cameras online and positioned them to cover my driveway, front yard, and both sides of the new fence. If someone wanted to mess with my property again, I'd have evidence. The emergency HOA meeting was that evening, and Frank texted me that it was, as he put it, a complete circus. Apparently, Brenda had whipped up a frenzy, and the board had voted to authorize legal action against me. They were also planning to fine me for violating HOA rules, despite my repeated explanations that I wasn't subject to their authority. Monday morning, I received a formal letter from Richard Bainbridge, the HOA's attorney. It informed me that I was in violation of several HOA covenants and was being fined $500 for unauthorized construction. It also stated that the HOA was filing a lawsuit seeking an easement by prescription for the walking trail. I immediately forwarded everything to Mitchell Hayes. He called me that afternoon. This is almost laughably weak, Mitchell said. They're trying to intimidate you, but they don't have a case. The fine is unenforceable since you're not an HOA member, and their easement claim won't hold up. I've looked at the historical records, and I can't find any evidence of continuous use going back 21 years. The subdivision wasn't even fully developed until the mid-90s. So what do? We respond to the lawsuit, of course. I'll file a motion to dismiss based on lack of standing. We'll also countersue for harassment and the cost of cleaning up the vandalism. How much did that run you? About $300 for the paint removal service. We'll include that. And Quinton, I want to be clear about something. This is going to get expensive. Even though we'll almost certainly win, legal fees add up. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my grandfather, who'd bought this land with his own money and built a life here. Yes, I said, this is worth fighting for. The next few weeks were tense. I continued to receive hostile looks from certain neighbors, though others made a point of being friendly and supportive. The fence stood firm, and the trail traffic obviously stopped, at least on my property. I noticed that some people were walking around the long way through the subdivision streets instead. One afternoon in early June, I was mowing my lawn when a car pulled up. A woman in her 30s got out, looking apologetic. "Mr. Thatcher? I'm Amanda Grant. I live over on Maple Street. Do you have a minute?" "Sure," I said, turning off the mower. "I wanted to apologize." Amanda said, "I use that trail regularly, and when you first blocked it off, I was annoyed. But then I did some research and talked to my husband, who's a paralegal, and I realized you're absolutely right. It is your property. I'm sorry for being one of the people who complained about you." Her honesty surprised me. I appreciate that. I know it's inconvenient, but no, it's not about convenience, she interrupted. It's about principle. If someone was using my property without permission, I'd be upset too. Brenda Carmichael convinced a lot of us that the trail was some kind of established right, but that's not how property law works. Anyway, I just wanted to say I support what you're doing, and I think you should know that not everyone in the neighborhood is against you. Thank you. Amanda, that really does mean a lot. She smiled and left, and I felt a little lighter. Maybe public opinion was starting to shift. The lawsuit moved forward at the typical glacial pace of civil litigation. Mitchell filed our motion to dismiss, and the HOA's attorney filed a response. There were depositions scheduled, document requests, and all the usual legal machinery. The whole thing was looking like it would take months to resolve. In the meantime, I focused on settling into my new home and my new job. I'd moved to Westerville to take a position as a software engineer with a company in Columbus, and the work was demanding enough to take my mind off the HOA drama. My house was finally feeling like home, and I'd even started dating someone I'd met at a coffee shop in town. But Brenda Carmichael wasn't done. In mid-July, I received a notice that the Township Zoning Board was reviewing a complaint about my fence. According to the complaint, filed anonymously, the fence violated setback requirements and hadn't been properly permitted. I knew this was nonsense. Dave Hoffman had pulled all the proper permits, and the fence was well within the required setbacks. But I still had to attend a zoning board hearing to defend it. The hearing was held on a Thursday evening at the Township building. I arrived with Dave Hoffman and all our documentation. Brenda was there too, sitting in the back row with a smug expression. The zoning board chairman, a retired engineer named Walter Schmidt, reviewed our permits and survey. "Mr. Thatcher, everything appears to be in order here. Can the complainant explain the basis for their objection?" An older man stood up, someone I'd never seen before. "The fence is an eyesore and negatively impacts the neighborhood character." "That's not a zoning violation," Walter said. "Aesthetic preferences aren't part of our code enforcement. Is there a specific code violation you're alleging?" The man stammered and sat back down. Walter looked around the room. "Anyone else?" Brenda stood up. "The fence blocks access to a community trail that's been in use for decades. Surely that's a relevant consideration." "This board has no jurisdiction over property rights disputes," Walter said firmly. "That's a matter for the courts. We only evaluate whether construction complies with township zoning codes. Based on the documentation presented, this fence is fully compliant." Complaint dismissed. I felt a rush of relief. As we left the building, Brenda intercepted me in the parking lot. "You think you've won, but you haven't," she hissed. "That trail is community property, and everyone knows it. You can't just move here and destroy something that doesn't belong to you." "It does belong to me," I said. "The deed is clear, and no amount of your tantrums is going to change that. We'll see what the judge says. I look forward to it." She stormed off, and Dave Hoffman let out a low whistle. "Man, she really has it out for you." She's used to being in charge, I said. This is probably the first time someone's told her no in years. August brought a break in the legal proceedings and a chance to enjoy summer. My girlfriend, Rachel, and I spent weekends exploring Ohio, hiking at Hocking Hills and visiting Lake Erie. The fence stood undisturbed, and the vandalism hadn't recurred, probably because my security cameras were now visible deterrents. But in early September, Mitchell Hayes called with news. The judge denied our motion to dismiss. She wants to hear the full case before ruling on the easement claim. Is that bad? It's not ideal, but it's not unexpected either. Judges sometimes want to see all the evidence before making a decision on property rights. The good news is that we're scheduled for trial in October. This won't drag on forever. What do I need to do? Prepare to testify. We'll go over everything beforehand, but the key is to be honest and stick to the facts. We have a strong case, Quinton. Don't worry. The trial was set for October 15th. As the date approached, I felt increasingly nervous. I'd never been involved in a lawsuit before, and the idea of testifying in court was intimidating. Mitchell assured me that I'd do fine, but I couldn't shake my anxiety. A week before the trial, something happened that changed everything. I was reviewing footage from my security cameras, something I did periodically to make sure everything was working properly. As I scrubbed through the recordings, I noticed something odd. On several occasions over the past month, someone had been coming onto my property late at night. The figure was always the same, a person in dark clothing approaching the fence around midnight. On September 28th, the footage showed this person doing more than just looking around. They were actively trying to damage the fence, kicking at the posts and attempting to pry boards loose. I zoomed in on the clearest frame and felt my stomach drop. Even in the low light, I could make out enough detail to identify the person. It was Brenda Carmichael. I immediately called Detective Moreno. She came by the next morning and reviewed the footage. "That's definitely criminal mischief," she said, "and if this is the HOA president, that's a serious problem. Can you export these files for me?" I provided her with copies of all the relevant footage. What happens now? I'll need to verify the identification and possibly get a warrant. If we can confirm this is Brenda Carmichael, she'll be arrested and charged. This is vandalism at a minimum, and given the ongoing civil dispute, it could be considered witness intimidation or obstruction. Will this affect the trial? I can't speak to that, but I imagine your attorney will want to know about it. Mitchell Hayes was ecstatic when I told him, "This is huge, Quinton. It completely undermines their credibility. If the HOA president is engaging in criminal activity to harass you, that speaks volumes about the legitimacy of their claims. I'm going to file a motion to introduce this evidence at trial." 3 days before the trial, Detective Moreno called. "We've arrested Brenda Carmichael. She's been charged with criminal mischief and trespassing." "Thought you'd want to know." I felt a mix of vindication and disbelief. What did she say? Initially denied everything, but the video evidence is pretty clear. She's out on bond now, but she's facing criminal charges. Her attorney is probably advising her to stay far away from you. The trial started on a cool October morning. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, and the proceedings felt almost anticlimactic after all the buildup. Mitchell presented our case methodically, showing the deed, the survey, the historical records proving my family's ownership since 1948, and the documentation of the HOA's formation in 1983. Richard Bainbridge, the HOA's attorney, tried to argue that continuous use of the trail had created an implied easement. He called several residents who testified that they'd been using the trail for years. But under cross-examination, Mitchell got them to admit they didn't know exactly when the trail started or whether my grandfather had given permission. The turning point came when Mitchell introduced the security camera footage showing Brenda's vandalism. The judge, a stern woman named Margaret Kellerman, looked visibly displeased. "Mr. Bainbridge, your client, the HOA president, has been arrested for vandalizing the defendant's property." "Your Honor, that's a separate criminal matter and not relevant to this case," Richard said, but he sounded less confident than usual. "It goes to credibility and to the pattern of behavior by the plaintiff," Mitchell argued. "The HOA has engaged in harassment, intimidation, and criminal activity to try to force Mr. Thatcher to give up his property rights." Judge Kellerman agreed to admit the evidence. After that, the trial felt like a formality. The HOA simply couldn't prove that the requirements for an easement by prescription had been met. They couldn't demonstrate hostile use, only permissive use at best, and they couldn't prove continuous use for the full 21-year statutory period. On October 18th, Judge Kellerman issued her ruling. She found in my favor on all counts. The trail was entirely on my private property, no easement existed, and I had every right to fence off my land. She also ordered the HOA to pay my legal fees and the costs associated with the fence and vandalism, cleanup. The total came to over $20,000. But she wasn't done. In a scathing portion of the ruling, Judge Kellerman criticized the HOA's conduct throughout the dispute. She noted that the HOA had no authority over my property, had engaged in harassment, and had wasted the court's time with a frivolous lawsuit. She warned that any future attempts to interfere with my property rights would be met with sanctions. I left the courthouse feeling like I was floating. Mitchell shook my hand and congratulated me. You stood up for your rights, and you won. That's not always how these things go. Thank you for everything, I said. I couldn't have done this without you. My pleasure. And Quinton, you might want to think about what you want to do with that land now. You've fought hard for it. Make sure it's worth it. I knew exactly what he meant. Over the next few weeks, as the dust settled, I thought about the property and what it meant to me. The fence had cost money and stress, but it had also established an important principle. This was my land, my inheritance, and my responsibility. Brenda Carmichael's criminal case proceeded separately. In November, she pleaded guilty to criminal mischief as part of a plea deal. She was sentenced to probation, community service, and was ordered to pay restitution for the damage to my fence. More significantly, the negative publicity from her arrest led to her resignation from the HOA board. A special election was held, and Frank Morrison was elected as the new president. Frank stopped by one evening after the election results were announced. Quinton, I want to thank you. You standing up to Brenda gave a lot of us the courage to push for change. The new board is going to be a lot more reasonable and a lot more focused on actual community service instead of power trips. I'm glad something good came out of all this, I said. There's something else, Frank continued. The new board wanted me to extend an official apology for how you were treated. What happened was wrong, and we want to make it right. We'd also like to formally acknowledge that your property isn't part of the HOA jurisdiction and that we have no authority over your land use decisions. I appreciate that, Frank. And one more thing, completely off the record and just as a neighbor. If you ever wanted to consider some kind of arrangement for trail access in the future, the board would be open to discussing it. Not now, obviously, but maybe someday, if it was structured properly with a real easement agreement, insurance, maintenance responsibilities, all that. No pressure at all. Just wanted you to know the door is open if you ever change your mind. I thought about it. Thanks, Frank. I'm not making any promises, but I'll think about it. Right now, I'm just enjoying having clear boundaries. Winter came to Westerville, and life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Rachel and I got more serious, and by Christmas, she'd moved in. We spent New Year's Eve sitting on the back porch, looking out at the snow-covered woods that marked my property line. The fence stood solid and strong, a reminder of the battle I'd fought and won. Do you ever regret it? Rachel asked. All the stress and money and fighting? I thought about my grandfather, about the principle of ownership and rights, about standing up to bullies. No, I said. Some things are worth fighting for. In February, I received a check from the HOA for the full amount of the judgment, $23,000 covering legal fees, the fence, and damages. I deposited it and used part of the money to make some improvements to the house that my grandfather had neglected in his final years. New windows, updated plumbing, a renovated kitchen. The house was finally becoming everything it could be. Spring arrived, and with it came a sense of closure. The fence had weathered its first winter well, and the woods behind my house were beautiful with new growth. Occasionally, I'd see someone walking along the public street that ran on the far side of the woods, taking the long way that didn't cross my property. It didn't bother me anymore. One Saturday in April, exactly a year after I'd inherited the property, I was working in the garden when Amanda Grant stopped by with her husband and 2 kids. "Hi, Quinton," she said. "We were out for a walk and thought we'd say hello. This is my husband Mark, and these are our kids, Sophie and James. Nice to meet you all, I said. Sophie, who looked about 8, was staring at the fence. Is that the fence everyone was fighting about? Sophie, Amanda said. Embarrassed, I laughed. It's okay. Yes, that's the fence. It's a nice fence, Sophie said seriously. We learned about property rights in school. Mrs. Henderson said it's important to respect other people's things. Sophie's teacher used your situation as a teaching example, Mark explained, about property rights and community responsibility. I hope that's okay. That's actually great, I said. The kids should learn about these things. After they left, I stood in my yard and looked at everything I'd fought to protect. The house, the land, the woods, the fence. It was mine, truly mine, and that meant something important. Not because I wanted to keep people out, but because I'd stood up for a principle that mattered. Over the following months, the neighborhood continued to evolve. The new HOA board under Frank's leadership was more transparent and reasonable. They focused on actual community improvements rather than petty rules enforcement. Several residents told me privately that the whole controversy had been a wake-up call about HOA overreach. Brenda Carmichael moved away in June. I heard through the grapevine that she'd taken a job in another city. Some people said she left because of the embarrassment from the criminal conviction and the lawsuit. Others said she'd just been ready for a change. Either way, her departure felt like the final chapter closing on the whole mess. In July, Rachel and I got engaged. We decided to get married on the property, in the backyard where the whole drama had started. It felt right, somehow, to celebrate love and new beginnings in the place where I'd fought so hard for my rights. The wedding was small, just family and close friends. Frank Morrison gave a toast that referenced the fence dispute without dwelling on it, talking about how standing up for what's right sometimes means facing opposition, but it's always worth it in the end. Everyone laughed and raised their glasses. As summer turned to fall, I found myself thinking about Frank's offer from months earlier. The trail access idea. I wasn't ready to open up my property again, not yet, maybe not ever. But I appreciated that the new HOA had been respectful enough to ask rather than demand, to acknowledge my rights rather than try to trample them. One October evening, almost exactly 2 years after the trial, I was walking the property line and examining the fence. It had held up remarkably well, and I felt proud of it. Not because it kept people out, but because it represented something important. Boundaries, rights, the willingness to stand up for principle even when it's hard. My phone rang. It was Mitchell Hayes, who'd become a friend over the course of the legal battle. Quinton, I just got some interesting news, he said. Remember Richard Bainbridge, the HOA's attorney? Of course, he was just sanctioned by the Ohio State Bar. Apparently, your case wasn't the only one where he encouraged clients to pursue frivolous lawsuits against property owners. There were complaints from 3 other cases. He's facing a suspension. Wow, I said. I can't say I'm surprised, but still. Thought you'd want to know. Your willingness to fight back probably helped expose a pattern of behavior that needed to be stopped. After we hung up, I sat on my back porch and watched the sun set over the woods. Rachel came out and joined me, handing me a beer. What are you thinking about? She asked. How strange life is, I said. A year and a half ago, I was just trying to settle into a new house. And instead, I ended up in a legal battle that changed the whole neighborhood. Do you think you'd do it again? If you could go back? I didn't hesitate. Absolutely. My grandfather bought this land in 1948. He was a veteran who worked hard his whole life. This property meant something to him, and now it means something to me. Nobody had the right to take that away, not an HOA, not entitled neighbors, nobody. I love that about you, Rachel said. You don't back down when you know you're right. We sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. The fence stood barely visible in the fading light, a boundary and a symbol. It had cost me money, time, and stress. It had made me enemies and taught me who my real friends were. But most importantly, it had taught me about the value of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. The property that had been in my family since 1948 would remain in my family, protected and cherished, and that made everything worth it. Winter came again, my second in the house. Rachel and I spent Christmas decorating and planning for the future. We talked about kids someday, about building a life here in Westerville, about being part of the community while still maintaining our boundaries and our rights. In January, Frank Morrison called with unexpected news. "Quinton, the HOA board has been discussing something, and I wanted to run it by you informally before anything official happens." "What's that?" "There's a parcel of land adjacent to the subdivision, about 5 acres of woods that the developer still owns. It's been for sale for years, but nobody's bought it. The board is considering trying to purchase it and turn it into an actual community park with legitimate trails, maybe some playground equipment, picnic areas. Would you be willing to serve on the planning committee? Given your experience with property rights and boundaries, we'd value your input." I was surprised but pleased. "I'd be happy to help with that." "Great. And Quinton, this isn't about replacing the trail that crossed your property. This is about creating something new and doing it right, with proper ownership, insurance, maintenance, all of it." "That's exactly how it should be done," I said. Over the next few months, I worked with the HOA board on the park project. It was a completely different experience from the conflict over the trail. Everyone was respectful, decisions were made democratically, and property rights were honored. The developer agreed to sell the land at a reasonable price, and the HOA secured a loan to make the purchase. By spring, the Oakmont Community Park was becoming a reality. Volunteers, including me, helped clear trails, install benches, and plant native flowers. It was everything the old unauthorized trail could have been if it had been done legally and properly from the start. At the park's opening ceremony in May, Frank Morrison gave a speech thanking everyone who'd contributed. He acknowledged me specifically, mentioning how the conflict over the trail had ultimately led to something better for the whole community. "Sometimes it takes standing up for what's right, even when it's unpopular, to create positive change," Frank said. "Quinton Thatcher did that, and we're all better for it. This park exists because we learned to respect property rights while still creating community amenities. That's how it should be." People applauded, and I felt genuinely moved. What had started as a bitter fight had transformed into something constructive and good. That summer, Rachel and I found out she was pregnant. We spent long evenings on the porch, talking about the future and what kind of world we wanted to raise our child in. A world where rights mattered, where people treated each other with respect, where community didn't mean trampling on individual property. "Our kid is going to grow up playing in these woods," Rachel said, resting her hand on her growing belly. "On land that's been in your family for almost 80 years. That's pretty special." "It is," I agreed. "And they'll learn about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. That's the lesson in all of this." As fall approached again, 3 years after I'd first moved to Westerville, I stood at my fence line and looked out at my property. The fence was weathered now, but still strong. Beyond it, the woods were beautiful with autumn colors, and in the distance, I could hear children playing at the new community park, using trails that had been created properly and legally. Everything had come full circle. The property that I'd fought to protect was now a source of pride and legacy. The neighborhood that had been divided was now unified around proper respect for both community and individual rights. And the fence that had been a symbol of conflict had become a symbol of principle. I thought about my grandfather, who I'd never really known as well as I should have. He'd bought this land in 1948 with dreams of building a life, raising a family, creating something lasting. He'd succeeded in ways he probably never imagined. The land had passed to his son, then to his grandson, and soon to his great-grandchild. The HOA had tried to take that away, tried to claim that community preference trumped legal ownership. They'd failed, as they should have, but in failing they'd learned an important lesson. Real community isn't built by ignoring property rights. It's built by respecting them while finding legitimate ways to create shared spaces and experiences. The fence stood as a reminder of that lesson. It would stand for years to come, a boundary that protected not just land but principles, and I was proud of every board, every nail, every dollar spent to defend what was rightfully mine. As winter approached once more, I took down the security cameras. They'd served their purpose, but I didn't need them anymore. The neighborhood had changed, and I no longer felt under siege. The fence was enough, a clear marker of boundaries that everyone now respected. Rachel gave birth to our daughter in December during a gentle snowfall. We named her Eleanor, after my grandmother. When we brought her home from the hospital, I carried her through the house and showed her the view from the back window, the fence line, and the woods beyond. "This is your legacy," I whispered to her. "Land that's been in our family since 1948. Your great-great-grandfather bought it with his own hands' work, and your father fought to keep it. Someday, you'll understand what that means." Eleanor slept peacefully in my arms, unaware of the battles that had been fought or the principles that had been defended. But she would learn. We would teach her about property rights, about standing up to bullies, about the importance of community that respects individual ownership. The fence outside stood solid in the snow, marking boundaries that would never again be challenged. It was more than wood and nails. It was a statement that rights matter, that ownership means something, that individuals can stand up to institutional pressure and win. As I sat with my daughter and watched the snow fall on our property, our land, our legacy, I felt a deep sense of peace. The fight had been worth it. Every dollar, every stressful moment, every confrontation. Because some things are worth fighting for, and property rights are among them. The story could have ended differently. I could have backed down, granted the easement, let the HOA have its way. Life would have been easier in the short term. But I would have lost something important, not just land but principle. Instead, I'd stood my ground. I'd fenced off the unauthorized trail that had crossed land that had been in my family's deed since 1948. And in doing so, I'd protected not just my own rights but the principle that individual ownership matters in America. The fence would stand for generations, and so would the lesson it represented.